Then I suppose I should help you find your dignity. Victoria, you seem to have lost it. The words fell from Arya's lips in a Moscow dialect so perfect, so chillingly aristocratic, that Victoria's champagne glass rattled against her manicured nails. The sneer that had been etched onto the socialite's face frozen into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Just seconds ago she had been whispering to her entourage in Russian, mocking the peasant who had dared to marry Silas Thorne. Assuming Arya's dark skin and simple black gown were markers of a woman who couldn't even spell the word diplomacy. The circle of women, the so-called gatekeepers of the Gala, stepped back instinctively as Arya's posture shifted. The quiet bookstore girl was gone. In her place stood a woman whose gaze held the cold precision of a diamond blade. You were saying in German that my presence here is a stain on the Blackwell legacy. Arya continued, her voice pivoting with terrifying ease into flawless, sharp-tongued High German. She turned to the woman on Victoria's left, whose face drained of color. Perhaps you should worry less about the stain of my dress and more about the stain on your husband's balance sheets. I believe the Frankfurt auditors would find your recent shopping trips to be quite criminal. The silence in the corner of the ballroom was no longer just quiet, it was a vacuum. Arya didn't give them a second to breathe. She turned to the Italian heiress, who had been laughing about Arya's lack of culture just moments before. And as for you, Arya said, the language flowing into a lyrical, rapid-fire Italian that sounded like music and thunder combined. Your family's vineyards are built on a history of art, forgery. I read the original manifests when I was working for the ministry. If I were you, I would stop talking about my pedigree before the Carabinieri start asking about yours. One by one, Arya moved through the elite. She countered a Mandarin insult about Silas's business weakness by detailing the exact flaws in the group's own hostile takeover plot. Speaking with a technical Mandarin vocabulary so advanced, it made their own accents sound like nursery rhymes. When a younger socialite tried to retreat while muttering a French slur, Arya caught her arm gently, whispering a correction of her verb conjugation in French that felt more like a al than a lesson. By the time Arya reached her sixth language, Portuguese, she was no longer just defending herself. She was dismantling an empire of ego. She spoke of their private shames, their hidden debts, and their hollow lives, using the very languages they had used to exclude her as the scalpels for their social autopsy. In Arabic, she addressed the final member of the group, a woman who had mocked Arya's mother. Arya's voice was low, vibrating with a power that seemed to hum through the floorboards. My mother taught me that words are the most powerful weapons in the world. It's a shame you never learned how to use yours for anything but cruelty. The Gala gatekeepers stood in a ruined circle, their expensive perfumes and diamonds, unable to hide the fact that they had been utterly outclassed. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps find one last shred of English defiance, but no words came. She realized that everyone, the French ambassador, the Japanese delegates, the Russian investors, was now watching. They weren't looking at the billionaire's wife, they were looking at a master of the world. Arya took a final sip of her water, set the glass down on a passing server's tray without looking away from Victoria, and smoothed her dress. You should really learn to speak more carefully, Arya said, returning to English with a calm, devastating smile. You never know who's listening, and in 8 different languages, you all sound exactly the same, small. The Grand Imperial Ballroom was a cavern of suffocating opulence, draped in gold leaf, and illuminated by 3-ton crystal chandeliers that seemed to hum with the weight of old money. Arya stood at the center of the swirling gala, her hand resting lightly on the arm of Silas Thorne, the man the media called the Titan of Tech. She wore a sleek, minimalist black gown, a choice that was deliberate in its quietness, yet it felt like a target in a room filled with excessive lace and inherited jewels. As Silas was pulled away by a persistent group of board members for a mandatory photograph, The atmosphere around Arya shifted instantly. The protective shield of his presence evaporated, leaving her alone in the middle of a sea of sharks who had been waiting for the water to clear. Victoria Lane moved with the practiced grace of a predator, her red silk dress trailing behind her like a fresh wound. She didn't just walk, she occupied space, flanked by a group of socialites whose eyes were as cold as the diamonds around their necks. As they converged on Arya, the air grew thick with the scent of expensive perfume and barely concealed malice. Then came the sound that silenced the nearby conversations, a sharp musical shatter. Victoria had stumbled with the precision of a stage performer, her elbow connecting with Arya's arm just as a server passed with a tray of vintage champagne. The crystal glass hit the marble floor, disintegrating into 1,000 shimmering shards that sprayed across the hem of Arya's black dress. A collective gasp rippled through the immediate circle, followed by a silence that felt heavier than the noise it replaced. Victoria didn't offer a hand or a word of apology. She simply stood there, a look of mock horror plastered onto her face that didn't quite reach her predatory eyes. "Oh, goodness," Victoria whispered, the volume calculated to carry across the ballroom. "How clumsy of me. Or was it you, dear?" It's so hard to tell when one isn't used to moving in such refined spaces. The whispers began almost before the last shard of glass had finished skittering across the floor. Did she just spill her drink? How embarrassing, a woman in a heavy sapphire necklace murmured to her companion. Poor Silas. He really should have known better than to bring a charity case to the Foundation Gala. You can take the girl out of the bookstore, but you can't take the bookstore out of the girl. The judgment was a physical weight, a wall of social exclusion designed to make Arya feel small, invisible and utterly out of place. The crowd stared, waiting for the flush of shame to creep up her neck, waiting for the stuttered apology, or the frantic attempt to clean the mess. But Arya didn't move. She didn't look down at the wet silk of her dress, or the mess at her feet. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her spine as straight as a blade of tempered steel. She looked directly at Victoria, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes reflecting the glitter of the chandeliers with a terrifyingly calm intensity. While the socialites saw a nobody from Brooklyn, who had lucked into a billionaire's heart, Arya was busy processing the room with the clinical efficiency of the intelligence cryptologist she had once been. She wasn't just standing there, she was listening, indexing every insult, every condescending smirk, and every linguistic slip-up the women around her were about to make. "It's a shame about the champagne," Arya said finally, her voice low and steady, cutting through the snickering like a cold breeze. She didn't raise her voice, yet somehow it seemed to carry further than Victoria's shrill theatrics. It was a 1990s, a bit of a waste for such a poorly executed performance, don't you think, Victoria? The socialite's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she realized that the poor black wife wasn't trembling. The glass had shivered, but Arya had. She remained the only calm point in a room full of people waiting for her to break, unaware that the 14-minute countdown to their own social destruction had just begun. 6 months before the shattering of the champagne glass, the air in Brooklyn had been thick with the scent of old paper and rain. Silas Thorne had entered the Inkwell, a narrow bookstore tucked between a bakery and a laundromat, looking for a refuge from the digital noise of his own life. He had been a man at the edge of his patience, carrying a slim laptop that contained a multi-billion-dollar problem, a kernel-level encryption error that had baffled his top engineers for 3 weeks and threatened to tank the Thorne-Vance merger. He sat at a scarred wooden table in the back, his fingers flying across the keys, his jaw tight as the screen flashed red again. To any onlooker, he was just another frustrated freelancer, but to the woman shelving a first-edition collection of Rilke, nearby he was a man struggling with a very specific, very elegant mathematical puzzle. Arya had been moving with a quiet rhythmic grace, her hands disappearing into the shadows of the shelves. She wore a simple knit sweater and a pair of worn black flats, the very picture of an unassuming clerk who lived her life between the margins of books. Silas hadn't even looked up when she approached the table, assuming she was coming to tell him the store was closing, or to offer a refill on the coffee he hadn't touched. Instead, she leaned over slightly, her eyes tracking the lines of code scrolling past his tired eye. She didn't say a word at first. She simply watched the logic loops fail, her mind deconstructing the syntax with the speed of a high-altitude interceptor. "You're using a static salt for a dynamic hash," she said, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the harsh light of the screen. Silas had frozen, his hands hovering over the keyboard as he finally looked up at the woman standing over him. He saw a face of striking intelligence, her eyes sharp and focused, lacking the glazed look of the tech sycophants who usually surrounded him. He had scoffed, a reflexive defense mechanism of a man who was used to being the smartest person in any room. He told her it was a proprietary algorithm, a piece of engineering so complex it would take a PhD to understand the architecture, let alone the error. Arya didn't take offense. She simply reached out, her fingers brushing the keys with a confidence that made Silas slide the laptop toward her without knowing why. "It's not just the salt," she murmured, her focus shifting entirely to the screen as she began to type. "Your recursive function is leaking memory at the 8th gate. You're trying to solve a quantum-ready problem with classical logic. You need a linguistic approach to the variables, not a numerical one." Silas watched paralyzed as the woman he thought was just a bookstore clerk began to rewrite the fundamental architecture of his empire's future. She moved through the code like she was translating poetry, her fingers dancing in a staccato rhythm that mirrored the rapid-fire brilliance of her mind. In less than 3 minutes, the red error screens vanished, replaced by a steady, pulsing green light, the signal that the encryption had stabilized. The multi-billion-dollar error that had stumped the brightest minds in Silicon Valley had been solved by a woman who moments ago had been worrying about the dust on a copy of the Odyssey. Silas stared at the screen, then back at Arya, who was already stepping back toward her cart of books, as if she hadn't just saved his career. "Who are you?" he had whispered, his voice thick with a mix of awe and sudden intense curiosity. Arya had only offered him a small, enigmatic smile as she picked up a stack of weathered hardcovers. "I'm the person who likes books," she replied, echoing the simplicity that defined her life. "And I like people who read them, even if they occasionally forget how to talk to the machines they build." She had walked away then, disappearing into the labyrinth of the shelves, leaving the most powerful man in tech sitting in a dusty Brooklyn corner, finally realizing that the greatest treasures weren't always bound in leather. Sometimes they were standing right in front of you, waiting to be read. The golden glow of the Grand Imperial Ballroom suddenly felt like the heat of an interrogation lamp as a tuxedoed Gala coordinator scurried toward them, his face pale with urgency. He whispered into Silas's ear, gesturing toward the main stage where the Blackwell Foundation's board of directors had gathered like a phalanx of stone statues. Silas stiffened, his hand tightened momentarily on Arya's arm before he turned to her with a look of genuine regret. He leaned in, his voice a low vibration meant only for her, promising he would be back in less than 10 minutes. He didn't want to leave her, especially not with the jagged remains of a champagne glass still shimmering on the floor near her feet. But the machinery of his empire demanded his presence. With a final lingering look of encouragement, Silas stepped away, his silhouette swallowed by the crowd as he moved toward the podium. The moment Silas was out of earshot, the atmosphere around Arya curbed. The Elite Eight, led by the crimson-clad Victoria Lane, closed in like a pack of wolves, sensing a scent of blood in the water. They didn't rush. They drifted, a slow-motion encirclement that cut Arya off from the rest of the room. Victoria stood at the front, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested Arya was a specimen under a microscope. She didn't bother with English anymore. If they were going to tear this interloper apart, they would do it in the languages of the civilized world, ensuring that the nobody from Brooklyn felt the full weight of her exclusion. Victoria turned to the woman beside her, a blonde heiress with a face like a porcelain doll, and began to speak in a rapid, fluid Parisian French. Her tone was light, almost conversational, but the words were dipped in venom. She remarked on how tragic it was that Silas had brought a femme de ménage, a housemaid, and dressed her in black to hide the fact that she didn't know how to carry the Thorn name. The women around her tittered, their laughter sharp and brittle. They glanced at Arya, watching for any flicker of understanding, any sign that the French barbs had pierced her skin. When Arya remained impassive, her face a mask of serene indifference,
Victoria's eyes flashed with a frustrated triumph. She assumed Arya's silence was the silence of the ignorant. Encouraged by Arya's lack of reaction, the porcelain-faced woman pivoted the attack into Spanish. She spoke of Arya's heritage with a casual high society cruelty, wondering aloud in Castilian Spanish if Arya's family even knew what a gala was, or if they were still back in their barrio wondering where their lucky daughter had gone. The Spanish was fast, colloquial, and filled with the kind of slang used by those who viewed the world as their personal playground. They mocked the simplicity of her gown again, calling it pobre and sin clase, laughing as they debated whether Silas had picked it out of a bargain bin to match her common background. Arya stood at the center of the verbal storm, her pulse steady, her mind recording every syllable with the cold precision of a forensic digital suite. She felt the eyes of the ballroom on her. Those who weren't in the circle were watching from the periphery, some with pity, most with the morbid curiosity of people watching a slow-motion car crash. The Shark Tank was in full feeding frenzy, and Victoria Lane was the alpha, her smile widening as she prepared to escalate the linguistic gauntlet. They believed they were speaking in a code Arya couldn't crack, unaware that every insult was being filed away in a mind that had spent years deconstructing the most complex ciphers in the world. Arya wasn't drowning in their sea of words. She was simply waiting for the tide to go out so she could show them exactly what she had found in the wreckage. The air in the circle grew thin, vibrating with the smug arrogance of women who believed their wealth granted them an impenetrable cloak of invisibility. Victoria Lane leaned in closer to her companions, her eyes flicking toward the stage where Silas was adjusting the microphone. The performance of social bullying shifted gears, moving from personal insults to something far more dangerous. Victoria's expression sharpened, the mean girl facade giving way to the cold, calculating look of a corporate saboteur. She whispered a sharp command in High German, and the group tightened their formation around Arya, effectively creating a soundproof wall of silk and Chanel. In German, Victoria began to outline the real reason for her hostility. It wasn't just about Arya's dress or her background, it was about the Thorne-Vance merger. She spoke with a guttural precision, detailing how her father's firm had already positioned short sellers to strike the moment the gala ended. They discussed the weak link in Silas's security, a backdoor entry point in his new encryption software that they believed was still vulnerable. They laughed, a cold Germanic sound, as they plotted to trigger a massive sell-off that would tank Silas's stock by 40% before the opening bell on Monday. They spoke of Der Untergang, the downfall of the Thorne Empire, right in front of the woman who shared his name, confident that the words were nothing more than harsh, unintelligible noise to her. Then the conversation took a sharp turn into Mandarin. The porcelain-faced heiress, whose family held significant interests in Asian markets, began to coordinate the international side of the betrayal. She spoke of the Shanghai investors, who were ready to pull their support at a prearranged signal, a move that would leave Silas's global literacy initiative, the very program he was about to announce, without a cent of funding. They discussed the dummy accounts they had set up to funnel the profits from the stock collapse, using Mandarin to mask the technical details of the transaction. They even joked about Arya's clueless expression, remarking in Mandarin that she looked like a decorative statue that didn't understand it was about to be moved to the basement. Arya stood motionless, her breathing rhythmic and shallow, her mind working like a high-speed process. Every German technical term for short-selling and every Mandarin reference to the Shanghai trade links was being indexed and cross-referenced. She wasn't just hearing them, she was seeing the digital architecture of their crime. The Elite Eight had moved beyond mere social exclusion. They were committing high-level corporate espionage in a ballroom filled with the very people they intended to rob. They felt invincible, emboldened by the racial and class-based assumption that a woman who looked like Arya could never possess the intellectual capacity to decipher the complex linguistic and financial codes they were using. Victoria took a final triumphant sip of her drink, her eyes locked on Arya's with a look of utter dismissiveness. She finished her Mandarin sentence with a flourish, detailing the exact time the first sell order would be placed. To the rest of the room, it was just a group of sophisticated women chatting in foreign tongues. To Arya, it was a signed confession. The sharks were no longer just circling. They had revealed exactly where they kept their tea. Arya felt a cold, familiar spark ignite deep within her, the same spark that had once helped her track international shadows for the government. The bookstore girl had seen enough. The cryptologist was now fully awake, and she was about to turn their secret plot into their public execution. The atmosphere within the tight circle of women shifted from cold calculation to a feverish, cruel playfulness. Victoria Lane, emboldened by the success of her linguistic gymnastics and Arya's continued silence, felt the urge to deliver a final crushing blow. The business plot was settled, the stock market sabotage was in motion, but the social humiliation remained incomplete. Victoria wanted to see a crack in the obsidian stillness of Arya's expression. She leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive elderflower liqueur and malice, and signaled her final transition. They had exhausted the European and Asian tongues. Now Victoria reached for a language she had learned during her summers in Dai, a language she associated with power, luxury, and the absolute hierarchy of the elite. In a low guttural Arabic, Victoria began to speak of Arya's mother. The insults were no longer about dress or decorum. They were ancient and visceral. She spoke of the woman who had worked 3 jobs in Brooklyn, describing her in terms of a servant, a woman whose only legacy was a daughter who had managed to seduce her way into a world she would never understand. Victoria mocked the very idea of a woman like Arya's mother, a woman of calloused hands and tired eyes, having any place in the same universe as the Thorn name. The words were chosen for their specific cultural weight, intended to be a deep, unrecoverable stain on Arya's dignity. The surrounding women, though only partially understanding the dialect, recognized the tone of absolute degradation and laughed behind their gloved hands, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of a public execution. As the Arabic syllables hit the air, something profound happened inside Arya. For months she had lived with the quiet, nagging voice of imposter syndrome, the feeling that she was a guest in her own life, that Silas's world was a stage, and she was merely an understudy waiting to be found out. She had allowed their slights to pass because she feared that her own power would be too much, that it would disrupt the peace she had built or overshadow the man she loved. But as Victoria's voice dragged her mother's name through the dirt in a language of the desert, that fear evaporated like mist under a midday sun. The silence that Arya had maintained wasn't a shield anymore. It was a liability. It was a cage that allowed these hollow, perfumed ghosts to believe they could walk over the memory of the woman who had taught Arya that knowledge was the only true freedom. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. By staying silent, she wasn't being humble. She was being complicit in her own erasure. She thought of the 12-year-old version of herself in the Brooklyn Library, teaching herself the very language Victoria was currently desecrating. She thought of the logic gates she had built and the ciphers she had broken. The bookstore girl was a beautiful part of her, but she was not the whole. Arya was a polymath, a linguistic shadow, a woman who had seen the inner workings of global intelligence before Victoria Lane had even learned how to properly curate a social media feed. The imposter syndrome didn't just fade, it shattered. Arya felt the weight of her 8 languages, her years of study, and her tactical training settle into her bones like armor. She didn't need Silas to protect her. She didn't need to blend into her minimalist black dress. Arya's eyes, which had been fixed on a point just past Victoria's shoulder, suddenly snapped into focus, locking onto Victoria's gaze with a terrifying predatory clarity. The air in the circle seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria, mid-sentence in a particularly foul Arabic metaphor, faltered. She saw the change. The way Arya's shoulders didn't just square, but seemed to expand. The way her chin rose, not with arrogance but with the absolute authority of someone who had just taken control of the room. The breaking point had been reached, but it wasn't Arya who had broken. It was the illusion of her weakness. The countdown had hit 0, and the quiet wife was about to speak for the first time. The air within the tight circle of women shifted from cold calculation to a feverish, cruel playfulness. Victoria Lane, emboldened by the success of her linguistic gymnastics and Arya's continued silence, felt the urge to deliver a final crushing blow. The business plot was settled, the stock market sabotage was in motion, but the social humiliation remained incomplete. Victoria wanted to see a crack in the obsidian stillness of Arya's expression. She leaned in, her breath smelling of expensive elderflower liqueur and malice, and signaled her final transition. They had exhausted the European and Asian tongues. Now Victoria reached for a language she had learned during her summers in Dai, a language she associated with power, luxury, and the absolute hierarchy of the elite. In a low guttural Arabic, Victoria began to speak of Arya's mother. The insults were no longer about dress or decorum. They were ancient and visceral. She spoke of the woman who had worked 3 jobs in Brooklyn, describing her in terms of a servant, a woman whose only legacy was a daughter who had managed to seduce her way into a world she would never understand. Victoria mocked the very idea of a woman like Arya's mother, a woman of calloused hands and tired eyes having any place in the same universe as the Thorn name. The words were chosen for their specific cultural weight, intended to be a deep, unrecoverable stain on Arya's dignity. The surrounding women, though only partially understanding the dialect, recognized the tone of absolute degradation and laughed behind their gloved hands, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of a public execution. As the Arabic syllables hit the air, something profound happened inside Arya. For months she had lived with the quiet nagging voice of imposter syndrome, the feeling that she was a guest in her own life, that Silas's world was a stage, and she was merely an understudy waiting to be found out. She had allowed their slights to pass because she feared that her own power would be too much, that it would disrupt the peace she had built or overshadow the man she loved. But as Victoria's voice dragged her mother's name through the dirt in a language of the desert, that fear evaporated like mist under a midday sun. The silence that Arya had maintained wasn't a shield anymore. It was a liability. It was a cage that allowed these hollow, perfumed ghosts to believe they could walk over the memory of the woman who had taught Arya that knowledge was the only true freedom. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. By staying silent, she wasn't being humble. She was being complicit in her own erasure. She thought of the 12-year-old version of herself in the Brooklyn Library, teaching herself the very language Victoria was currently desecrating. She thought of the logic gates she had built and the ciphers she had broken. The bookstore girl was a beautiful part of her, but she was not the whole. Arya was a polymath, a linguistic shadow, a woman who had seen the inner workings of global intelligence, before Victoria Lane had even learned how to properly curate a social media feed. The imposter syndrome didn't just fade, it shattered. Arya felt the weight of her 8 languages, her years of study, and her tactical training settle into her bones like armor. She didn't need Silas to protect her. She didn't need to blend into her minimalist black dress.
Arya's eyes, which had been fixed on a point just past Victoria's shoulder, suddenly snapped into focus, locking onto Victoria's gaze with a terrifying, predatory clarity. The air in the circle seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victoria, mid-sentence in a particularly foul Arabic metaphor, faltered. She saw the change, the way Arya's shoulders didn't just square, but seemed to expand. The way her chin rose, not with arrogance, but with the absolute authority of someone who had just taken control of the room. The breaking point had been reached, but it wasn't Arya who had broken. It was the illusion of her weakness. The countdown had hit 0, and the quiet wife was about to speak for the first time. The transition was so seamless it felt like the atmospheric pressure in the grand imperial ballroom had suddenly inverted. Victoria's circle had shifted their mockery into a sharp staccato Japanese, assuming the linguistic barrier was now an impenetrable fortress. The youngest of the group, a girl with pearls tight enough to choke her, sneered about Arya being a niño, a doll who lacked the gears to even she was being played. She laughed, a high-pitched, brittle sound, but the laughter died in her throat as Arya's voice cut through the air, vibrating with a tonal precision that was undeniably native. "I am no doll," Arya said in flawless formal Japanese, her gaze narrowing as she stepped directly into the girl's personal space. "But if I were, I would be the kind that comes with a warning. And your grammar, much like your sense of discretion, is shockingly unrefined. You should learn that in this language, the way you speak to a superior reflects more on your lack of breeding than mine." The girl recoiled as if she had been slapped, her hair draining of all color. The surrounding socialites froze, their fans pausing mid-air, their polished facades cracking to reveal the panic beneath. Arya didn't pause to let them recover. She pivoted on her heel, her sleek black gown swirling like a shadow, and locked eyes with the Italian heiress who had been whispering about forgeries and common blood. "And you," Arya continued, the language shifting instantly into a rich, rapid-fire Italian that echoed off the high ceilings like a verdict. You speak of heritage while your father's gallery is currently being investigated by the Comando Carabinieri for the reappearance of the lost Bellini. I suggest you spend less time analyzing my pedigree and more time preparing your family for the sannel that is going to erase your name from every guest list in Rome by Tuesday morning. The Italian woman gasped, her hand flying to her throat, but Aria was already moving. The silence in their corner of the ballroom was now an absolute suffocating vacuum. The other guests at the gala began to drift closer, drawn by the strange, magnetic authority of the woman they had all ignored for 3 hours. Aria turned to Victoria Lane, who was trembling with a mixture of rage and burgeoning terror. Before Victoria could find her breath, Aria addressed the group's Portuguese liaison in a dialect so sharp and commanding it commanded the attention of the Brazilian trade minister standing 20 feet away. "You thought the darkness of my skin meant I was invisible," Aria said in Portuguese, her voice a low, dangerous melody. "You thought my silence was a sign of a mind that couldn't grasp your complexity. But I have been listening to every word of your secret business plot. I have heard every German whisper of sabotage and every Mandarin plan to betray the Thorn-Vance merger. You haven't been talking over me, you've been confessing to me." As the final Portuguese syllable landed, a dead, heavy silence fell over the entire ballroom. Even the orchestra seemed to fade into the background as the power dynamic of the room shifted on its axis. Aria stood at the center of the cowering Elite Eight, no longer the bookstore clerk or the billionaire's accessory. She was the most dangerous person in the room, a polymath who had just turned their own weapons against them. Victoria Lane stared at her, her mouth open but her voice gone, realizing too late that she hadn't trapped a mouse in her circle. She had cornered a queen who spoke the languages of their destruction. The vacuum of silence around the Elite Eight had now expanded, pulling in the gravity of the entire ballroom. Aria took a slow, deliberate step toward the porcelain-faced heiress who had spearheaded the Mandarin coordination of the stock sabotage. The woman tried to shrink back, but she was pinned by the sheer weight of Aria's presence. Aria's voice returned to that melodic, terrifyingly precise Mandarin, but this time it wasn't a rebuke of manners, it was an execution of intent. She detailed the exact routing numbers of the Shanghai dummy accounts they had discussed, her tone clinical as she recited the timestamps of the planned sell orders. The heiress began to hyperventilate, realizing that Aria hadn't just understood the language, she had mapped the entire digital trail of their treason. "Your investors will be interested to know," Aria concluded in a whisper that carried like a shout, "that their capital is being used as a shield for your father's personal debts. I've already sent a summary of this merger strategy to the Regulatory Commission. By the time the markets open in Shanghai, you won't be a socialite, you'll be a defendant." The woman's knees buckled, and she had to be caught by her startled assistant. Aria didn't blink. She turned her focus to Victoria Lane, the architect of the evening's cruelty, who was now ashen, her red dress looking like a shroud. Victoria's hand was shaking so violently that the remains of her drink sloshed over her fingers, but she still tried to muster a final desperate sneer. Aria didn't give her the chance. She moved in, closing the distance until she was inches from Victoria's face, and when she spoke, she chose the cold, harsh vowels of a Moscow winter. The Russian flowed from Aria with a brutal aristocratic authority that suggested she hadn't just learned the language, but had mastered the secrets of the people who spoke it. She didn't talk about the gala or the dress, she spoke about the Vesper Holdings accounts, the untraceable offshore shells Victoria had been using to embezzle from her own family's charitable trust, to fund a lifestyle her dwindling inheritance could no longer support. Aria's voice was like a scalpel, peeling back the layers of Victoria's carefully curated life to reveal the rot beneath. She spoke of the private investigators, the forged signatures, and the looming audit that Victoria thought she had buried. "You called me the help earlier, Victoria," Aria said, the Russian words sharp and biting. "But I think the word you're looking for is bankrupt. Not just in your accounts but in your soul. Your family will disown you before the sun rises, not because you were cruel to me, but because you were sloppy with their money.
Victoria's glass finally slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble in a perfect echo of the earlier incident, but this time no one whispered, "Poor Silas." The room was paralyzed by the revelation of Victoria's fraud. The Russian ambassador, standing near the buffet, lowered his glass, his expression one of profound shock and newfound respect, as he realized the woman he'd dismissed was speaking his mother tongue with more power than his own attachment. Arya stood amidst the wreckage of Victoria's reputation, her black gown making her look like a dark judge in a room of glittering sinners. She had used their tongues to build a gallows for their egos, and as she looked around at the disgraced circle, she saw that they were no longer sharp. They were just small, frightened people who had run out of words. Silas Thorne chose that exact moment to step down from the podium, the applause for his speech dying away as he felt the heavy, electric tension in the room. He pushed through the crowd expecting to find Arya in distress, but he stopped short when he saw her. She wasn't the woman who needed his protection. She was the woman who had just conquered the room. Victoria was weeping, the heiress was catatonic, and the rest of the circle was scattered like leaves in a storm. Arya turned to him, her expression softening just a fraction, the fire in her eyes still burning but no longer aimed at him. She had finished the takedown, and the social standing of the Blackwell elite had been dismantled in 8 different languages. The devastation Arya had wrought left a physical wake, a literal clearing in the center of the Grand Imperial Ballroom, where Victoria Lane and her cohort stood as ruins of their former selves. But as the Elite Eight began to retreat into the shadows of the velvet curtains, a new movement began from the far corners of the room. It wasn't the snickering gossip of socialites, but the measured, heavy footfalls of the world's true architect. The French ambassador, a man who had navigated 3 decades of geopolitical minefields, moved first. He did not approach Silas, he approached Arya. He stopped exactly 3 paces away, his eyes scanning her face with a look of profound recognition. In a gesture that caused a ripple of audible gasps to travel through the hall, he inclined his head in a deep, formal bow, the kind reserved for high-ranking dignitaries or legendary shadows of the intelligence world. "Madame Thorne," the ambassador said, speaking a French so archaic and formal it was practically a forgotten dialect of the old aristocracy. "I haven't heard that specific inflection, the Northern intelligence cadence, since the Brussels Accord negotiation. We were told the ghost of the grid had retired to a quiet life. I see now she simply moved to a more interesting theater." Before Arya could respond, the Japanese trade minister and the Russian consul general joined the circle, effectively walling off the disgraced socialite. They didn't just stand near her, they formed a phalanx of respect. The Japanese minister spoke in a tone of hushed reverence, noting that Arya's command of the Keigo honorifics was more precise than many of his own attachments. They ignored Victoria Lane as if she were a piece of discarded furniture, their attention entirely captivated by the woman they had previously overlooked. The air of the gala had shifted from one of predatory exclusion to one of high-level diplomatic summit. The delegates began to speak to her in a rapid-fire succession of languages, Arabic, Portuguese, German, not to test her but to consult her. They realized that the woman standing in the simple black dress was the one who had truly understood the global implications of the evening's hidden agendas. Silas Thorne stood on the periphery of this new circle, his heart hammering against his ribs, in a way that had nothing to do with business. He had known Arya was brilliant, he had seen her fix his code in a dusty bookstore, but he had never seen this. He watched as the most powerful men in the room sought her opinion on the very literacy initiative he had just announced. He watched as the Russian consul laughed at a sharp, linguistic joke Arya made in his native tongue, a joke that also served as a subtle warning about the security of their upcoming trade deal. Silas realized in that moment that while he had been trying to protect Arya from the sharks of his world, she had been the one holding the keys to the entire ocean. He wasn't the sun she was orbiting. They were a binary star system, and her light was currently blinding every person in the building. The Japanese minister turned to Silas, his eyes sparkling with a rare warmth. "Thorne-san," he said in English, though his nod remained directed at Arya. "You are a very successful businessman, but tonight we see you have made your most brilliant acquisition of all. Although I suspect acquisition is the wrong word, you have found a partner who speaks the world's truths before the world even knows they have been spoken. Arya caught Silas's eye through the crowd of bowing dignitaries and nodding ambassadors. The imposter syndrome was not just gone, it had been incinerated and replaced by a quiet, radiant sovereignty. She reached out and took Silas's hand as he finally stepped into the circle, and for the first time, the Elite Eight saw what true power looked like. It wasn't the loud, colorful vitriol of those who inherited their status. It was the quiet, multilingual authority of a woman who had built herself from nothing, and now held the respect of the world in the palm of her hand. The gala continued, but the hierarchy had been permanently rewritten. The socialites were now the outsiders, and the bookstore girl from Brooklyn was the new queen of the Grand Imperial. The applause that erupted in the Grand Imperial ballroom was not the polite rhythmic patter of a social obligation. It was a roar, a tidal wave of genuine acclaim that shook the very crystals of the chandelier. Silas stood by Arya's side, his hand firmly entwined with hers, feeling the electric current of her triumph. He realized then that the standing ovation wasn't for his speech, nor for his billion-dollar foundation. It was for the woman who had just dismantled a century of elitism with 8 perfectly sharpened tongues. The high-level delegates, the ambassadors, and the tech titans were all looking at Arya with a hunger for her intellect that Silas had previously only seen directed at himself. As the applause began to settle into a respectful hum, the silence of the Elite Eight became a deafening voice. Victoria Lane stood frozen, her face a sallow gray, watching as her world, the only world she had ever known, literally turned its back on her. Silas turned his gaze toward her, and the warmth he had shown the delegates vanished, replaced by the cold, uncompromising iron that had built Thorn Industries. He didn't need to yell, his voice carried with the weight of a final judgment. "Gregory, Victoria," Silas said, addressing the ringleaders of the evening's cruelty. "I believe our business concluded the moment you decided to use my wife's dignity as a stepping stone for your own amusement." The real estate tycoon Gregory Hamilton stepped forward, his face flushed with a desperate, sweaty panic. "Silas, wait, it was just gala banter. We didn't know, that's the problem." "Gregory," Silas interrupted, his voice cutting through the man's excuse like a blade. "You only respect what you fear, or what you think can benefit you. You didn't see the most brilliant mind in this room, because you were too busy looking at the labels on her dress. My office will be sending over the termination papers for the Midtown development and the Shanghai logistics contract by dawn. I don't do business with people who lack the basic human intelligence of kindness." The gasps that followed were sharper than the sound of the breaking glass. $50 million in contracts had just evaporated in the time it took to breathe. Victoria Lane tried to speak, her lips trembling, but Arya simply looked at her, not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet pity. It was the look of someone who had seen the vastness of the world, and was watching a small, trapped bird beat its wings against a cage of its own making. "You don't have to hide anymore, Arya," Silas whispered, leaning down so his forehead touched hers, for a brief, intimate second amidst the chaos of the room. Arya felt a strange, soaring lightness in her chest. For years she had thought that her genius was a burden to be managed, a secret to be kept so that others wouldn't feel diminished in her presence. She had sought the shadows of the bookstore because she thought the light of the world was too harsh for a woman like her. But as she looked at Silas, and then out at the room of people who were now waiting for her next move, she realized that she didn't need to be small to be loved. She didn't need to be invisible to be safe. Silas hadn't fallen in love with the quiet clerk, he had fallen in love with the woman who could rewrite the stars. Arya stepped forward, no longer the billionaire's wife, but the architect of her own destiny. She addressed the French ambassador and the Japanese minister, her voice steady and clear. "If we are to talk about the Global Literacy Initiative," she said, her smile radiant and true, "let's do it in a way that ensures every child, regardless of their background, has the tools to speak back to power. Shall we begin?" The couple walked toward the private lounge, followed by the world's most powerful leaders, leaving the disgraced socialites behind in the wreckage of their own prejudice. As they exited the ballroom, the city lights of New York twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off Arya's eyes. She had entered the gala as an outlier, an accessory to be mocked. She left it as a legend. Together, Silas and Arya weren't just a power couple, they were a new language of power, entirely, one built on brilliance, resilience, and the unshakable truth that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should fear and respect the most.